He wasn't supposed to find anyone at his daughter's grave. Not at 8 a.m. and on a Tuesday morning. Not after 3 years of silent, solitary mourning. But there she was, a black teenage girl kneeling at Emily's headstone, shoulders trembling, weeping like she'd lost family. Timothy Lee stopped cold on the stone path, his red rose gripped tighter than necessary. Who is this girl, and why does she look more broken than I feel? What began as an unwanted intrusion would soon shatter everything Timothy thought he knew about his late daughter. And the most shocking part, that girl didn't just stumble upon the grave. She may have known Emily better than her own father ever did. Before we dive into this unforgettable story, every week we share stories that would otherwise go untold. Stories that move, inspire, and remind us of what really matters. Subscribe now and help us reach our next milestone. Your support isn't just a number. It's a way to keep these voices alive and make sure no one with a story worth telling gets left behind. The fog hung low over the cemetery that Tuesday morning in early winter. Timothy Lee's polished shoes clicked rhythmically along the stone path, each step measured, controlled. Every month, without fail, he came, always alone, always at 8 a.m., and always carrying a single red rose, Emily's favorite. In his right hand, the rose. In his chest, the same hollow ache he'd carried for 3 years. But that morning, something was different. From a distance, through the mist, he saw her, a figure kneeling at Emily's grave. Timothy stopped mid-step, his breath caught. It didn't make sense. No one else ever visited that grave. Not classmates, not colleagues, not even distant relatives. Emily's death had been public, her funeral massive, but her memory? That was his burden alone. The girl looked young, maybe 14, 15 at most. Worn jacket, faded jeans, a backpack slung over one shoulder. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, damp from the morning dew. She didn't move as Timothy approached. She just knelt there, head bowed, shoulders shaking. In her hands, a cheap bouquet of wildflowers, humble, hand-picked, unbought. Timothy stopped a few feet away, discomfort tightening his chest. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharp and clipped, the tone he used in boardrooms. "This is my daughter's grave." The girl looked up. Her eyes were red, wet with tears that hadn't stopped falling. When she spoke, her voice cracked. "Sir, Emily promised she'd come back for me." Timothy blinked. His mind scrambled for logic, for context, for anything that made sense. "Emily?" he asked, disbelief coloring every syllable. "You knew my daughter?" She nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. He wanted to dismiss it, a case of mistaken identity, a confused teenager at the wrong grave. But something in her eyes stopped him. Not manipulation, not performance, just raw, unshakable honesty. "You're mistaken," Timothy said, though his voice wavered. "You didn't know her." The girl didn't argue. She didn't plead. She just looked at him with sadness so deep it felt older than her years. She stood slowly, brushed off her jeans, and laid the wildflowers gently on Emily's headstone. Then, with quiet simplicity, she said, "She was more than you think." And then she walked away. Timothy stood frozen, his pristine red rose trembling in his hand. The girl disappeared into the fog, leaving only her flowers behind, wild, imperfect, and somehow more honest than anything Timothy had ever brought. Who was that girl? And how did she know Emily? Timothy woke before dawn the next morning. The clock read 4:32 a.m. when his eyes opened, staring at the ceiling as if it held answers. He couldn't shake her face. That girl, her voice, those words. "Emily promised she'd come back for me." They echoed like an accusation. He rose with tension coiled in his chest, the kind that told him something was deeply, irreversibly out of place. And it was. By 6 a.m., Timothy was already showered, suited, and seated in his home office with his first espresso and a stack of quarterly reports. He threw himself into CEO mode, emails answered in clipped sentences, conference calls scheduled across 3 time zones, acquisition projections reviewed with surgical precision. This was the armor he knew. Numbers, strategy, control. But Emily kept intruding on his thoughts. During a video call with Tokyo investors, he found himself staring past the screen at the framed photo on his credenza. Emily in a champagne-colored gown at the hospital charity gala, her arm looped through his, both of them smiling for the cameras. Perfect posture, perfect daughter, perfect image. That photo had run in 3 business magazines. The caption read, Tech Titan Timothy Lee and daughter Emily champion pediatric care reform. He'd crafted that narrative himself. Emily is the face of compassion, the heir to his empire's philanthropic legacy. Scholarships established in her name after her death. Press releases about her dedication to service. A wing of the children's hospital bearing her initials. But had he ever asked Emily what she wanted to champion? The question unsettled him so deeply he ended the call early. That evening, Timothy returned to the mansion just after 8. The house staff had already gone for the night. The silence pressed against him as he climbed the curved staircase to the 2nd floor, past portraits of family lineage and achievement, until he stood before the door he hadn't opened in months. Emily's room. He pushed it open slowly. The air inside smelled faintly of lavender and dust, preserved, untouched, a museum to a life cut short. Trophies lined the shelves, debate team captain, valedictorian, volunteer of the year. Framed certificates hung in perfect rows. A college acceptance letter from Stanford, matted and displayed like fine art. But very little that felt truly lived in. Timothy moved through the room methodically, opening drawers, flipping through yearbooks, checking old phones he'd kept charged out of habit. He searched for anything that would explain this Jane girl. A friend he'd overlooked, a classmate he'd forgotten, a reasonable explanation that would restore order to his understanding. He found nothing obvious. Just the polished surface Emily had presented to the world. Homecoming photos with carefully selected friends. Thank you cards from fundraiser attendees. A planner filled with AP classes and extracurriculars he'd approved. Then, tucked inside one of Emily's spiral notebooks from her senior year, wedged between calculus notes and college essay drafts, Timothy found something that didn't belong. A worn flyer, creased, faded, printed on cheap paper. Riverside Community Tutoring Center volunteer. Mentor, make a difference. Saturday mornings at 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. an address in a neighborhood Timothy had only ever seen from the highway. A phone number scrawled in Emily's handwriting in the margin. A small star drawn next to the words, make a difference. Timothy stood frozen, the flyer trembling in his hand. He'd never heard Emily mention this place. Not once, not in passing, not in their monthly check-in dinners where he'd asked her surface-level questions and accepted surface-level answers. He resisted the idea that Emily had a secret life. It felt impossible, melodramatic even. Emily told him everything. Didn't she? But the unease wouldn't leave. It crawled beneath his skin, settled in his chest, whispered the question he didn't want to ask. What else didn't I know? Timothy folded the flyer carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Tomorrow he would find that girl, Jane, if that was even her real name. He would get answers, if only to prove she was lying. Jane Bridge woke to the sound of her grandmother coughing in the next room. Harsh, rattling coughs that echoed through the thin walls of their cramped 2-bedroom apartment. The clock on her nightstand, taped together after the screen cracked, blinked 5:47 a.m. She lay still for a moment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of nowhere. Outside, the rumble of garbage trucks and distant sirens filled the pre-dawn darkness. This was Jane's world. Overdue bills stacked on the kitchen counter, a fridge held shut with duct tape, and the constant pressure of survival pressing down on everything. Her grandmother shuffled past her door, slippers scraping linoleum, muttering something about the heating bill they couldn't pay. Jane closed her eyes and felt the familiar weight settle on her chest, the weight of guilt so heavy she could barely breathe. Emily died because of me. The thought came every morning, relentless and suffocating. If she hadn't asked Emily for help that day, if she hadn't been so desperate, so needy, Emily would still be alive. Emily would still be volunteering at the tutoring center, still texting Jane Lee messages before exams, still promising her a future Jane couldn't afford to dream of alone. For 3 years, Jane had visited the grave in secret, every month when she could scrape together bus fare. Sometimes more. She'd kneel on the cold ground, lay down wildflowers she picked from empty lots, and talked to Emily as if she were still listening. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. Jane got up, dressed in the same jeans she'd worn all week, and pulled on her worn jacket. In the kitchen, she found half a box of cereal and no milk. Her grandmother sat at the wobbly table, sorting pill bottles and squinting at labels she could barely read. You eating? Her grandmother asked without looking up. I'm good, Nana. I'll grab something at school. A lie. But Jane had become good at those. She grabbed her backpack and slipped out before her grandmother could ask more questions. The morning air was cold and damp, the kind that seeped through cheap fabric and settled in your bones. Jane walked 3 blocks to the bus stop, counting cracks in the sidewalk to keep her mind quiet. But the memories came anyway. The first time she met Emily was at the Riverside Community Tutoring Center on a Saturday morning 2 weeks into ninth grade. Jane had been failing algebra, drowning in equations she couldn't decode, convinced she was too stupid to understand. Emily sat across from her at a scratch table in the corner, patient and unhurried, breaking down problems into pieces that finally made sense. She didn't talk down to Jane. She didn't make her feel small. She just saw her. You're smart, Jane, Emily had said, smiling in that way that lit up her whole face. You just needed someone to show you the bridge. After that, Emily was there every Saturday, helping with homework, listening to Jane's dreams of becoming an engineer, making her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could be more than the neighborhood expected. And then came the promise Jane replayed in her mind every single day. When you turn 18, we're going to get you into college. I'll help you cross that bridge. I swear. On the bus to school, Jane pressed her forehead against the smudged window and counted, treble. 1,094 days since Emily died. She remembered every detail of that morning, the screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, the way Emily's hand went limp in hers before the ambulance arrived. Jane squeezed her eyes shut. She'd replayed the accident so many times it felt like a film reel stuck on loop. If she'd waited one more week to ask for help, if she'd told Emily not to come, if she'd just... Her phone buzzed, a notification reminding her she had a chemistry test today she hadn't studied for. Jane deleted it. She was terrified that Timothy Lee, Emily's billionaire father, would ban her from the cemetery. Or worse, call the police and accuse her of trespassing, of disturbing his perfect morning ritual. She'd seen the way he looked at her, suspicious, angry, like she was an intruder in his grief. But something inside Jane, something stubborn and aching, told her Emily wanted him to know. Emily had talked about her father sometimes, always with love, but also with sadness. He's a good man, she'd say, but he doesn't really see people. Not the way I wish he would. Maybe that's why Emily never told him about Jane. Maybe she knew he wouldn't understand, or maybe she was waiting for the right moment that never came. The bus lurched to a stop outside Jane's school. She stood, adjusting her backpack, steadying her breath. By the time she stepped onto the sidewalk, she'd made her decision. If Timothy came back to the cemetery, if he wanted answers, she would tell him more, whether he believed her or not. Timothy returned to the cemetery 2 days later, the worn flyer folded in his pocket like evidence he wasn't ready to present. He walked the stone path slower this time, half expecting the girl to be gone, a figment of grief-induced imagination, and half hoping she'd be there waiting with answers. She was. Jane sat on a weathered bench near Emily's grave, clutching the same cheap bouquet of wildflowers, her backpack at her feet. She looked smaller in the daylight, younger, more fragile. When she saw Timothy approaching, she tensed but didn't run. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, voice softer than before. I need to know the truth. Jane looked up at him, eyes wary but steady. I told you the truth. You said Emily promised she'd come back for you. What does that mean? Jane took a breath. She volunteered at Riverside Community Tutoring Center. Every Saturday morning, she tutored kids like me, kids who couldn't afford private help. She used just her first name, Emily, no last name, no big announcements. Timothy's jaw tightened. That's impossible. I would have known. Would you? Jane's voice wasn't accusing, just honest. She said you were busy, always working, always saving the world from boardrooms. The words stung more than Timothy wanted to admit. Jane continued, her voice quieter now. She called you Papa T. She said you hated that nickname, but she used it anyway when you weren't around. She scrunched her nose when she was thinking hard about math problems. Like this. Jane demonstrated, wrinkling her nose in a gesture so achingly familiar, Timothy's breath caught. How, yeah, he started. She told me about the time you tried to teach her to ride a bike in the driveway, and she crashed into your car. She said you were more worried about her scraped knee than the dent in the hood. She said that was the last time she saw you choose her over something expensive. Timothy felt his world tilt. That story, that private childhood memory, no one knew that. Not business partners, not household staff. Just him and Emily. Jane reached into her backpack and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. This is the address, Riverside Community Tutoring Center. They knew her, not like the news did. She handed it to him and stood, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. If you want to know who Emily really was, go there. They'll tell you. Then she walked away, leaving Timothy standing alone with an address that felt like a doorway to a daughter he'd never met. Timothy drove himself, no chauffeur, no security detail, following the GPS through parts of the city he'd only ever seen as statistics and reports. The buildings grew older, paint peeling from wooden facades. Kids played in cramped lots, surrounded by chain-link fences. Flyers for free meals and health clinics plastered every telephone pole. He parked his sedan in front of a modest brick building with a hand-painted sign. Riverside Community Tutoring Center. Everyone deserves a bridge. Inside, the space was warm but worn. Mismatched chairs, scratched tables, walls covered with student artwork and motivational posters. A woman in her 50s looked up from a desk cluttered with papers. "Can I help you?" she asked. Timothy hesitated. "I'm looking for information about a volunteer. Emily. She would have been here about 3 years ago." The woman's face lit up immediately. "Emily, oh my God, yes. Emily was one of our best. Saturday mornings, 9 to noon, like clockwork." Timothy's chest tightened. "Can you tell me about her?" The woman, her name tag read Mrs. Lopez, smiled with genuine warmth. "She tutored math mostly, but she'd help with anything. Reading, writing, science. She stayed late if a kid needed extra time. She brought snacks from her own money. Granola bars, juice boxes, fruit. The kids loved her." Another staff member, a younger man, joined the conversation. "Emily didn't just tutor. She cared. She remembered birthdays. She checked in on kids when they were struggling. One girl, Jane, Emily practically adopted upon her, came to her school events, helped her family with groceries." Timothy stood frozen, unable to speak. This Emily, the one who stayed late, who brought snacks, who showed up for a struggling teenager, was a stranger to him. "Why didn't she tell anyone?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Lopez looked at him kindly. "She said she didn't want attention. She said helping people wasn't about credit. It was about showing up." Timothy felt the ground shift beneath him. All those Saturday mornings when he thought Emily was at yoga or brunch with friends, she'd been here, in this humble building with peeling paint and mismatched chairs, giving pieces of herself he never invested time to see. He thanked them quietly and walked back to his car, hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. Emily's words, delivered through Jane, echoed in his mind. "Tell my dad to see people, really see them." For the first time, Timothy understood. He'd spent 3 years mourning a daughter he'd never truly known. Back home, Timothy couldn't sit still. The conversation with Mrs. Lopez and the tutoring center staff replayed in his mind. She stayed late. She brought snacks. She cared. Words that described a daughter he'd somehow missed completely. He climbed the stairs to Emily's room with new eyes, no longer looking for the perfect daughter he'd curated for public consumption, but for the real one, the one who'd lived a secret life of compassion he'd been too distant to notice. Timothy tore through Emily's belongings methodically. Closets, drawers, shelves stacked with yearbooks and photo albums. Then, in the back corner of her walk-in closet, hidden behind shoeboxes that hadn't been touched in years, he found it. A plain cardboard box, taped shut, with "Private" written in Emily's handwriting on the side. His hands trembled as he pulled it out, and set it on Emily's bed. Inside, carefully arranged, was a worn spiral notebook with a floral cover and a thick folder stuffed with papers. Timothy opened the notebook. The first page read simply, "Things I wish I could tell Dad." He sank onto the edge of the bed and began to read. October 12th. Met Jane today. She's brilliant, like scary smart, but she thinks she's stupid because no one's ever told her otherwise. She reminds me of myself before I had tutors and resources, and Dad opening doors I didn't even know existed. I want to be that for her. Not money, just presence. November 3rd, Jane's being bullied at school. Kids call her charity case and food stamp girl. It breaks my heart. She showed up to tutoring with her eyes all red, pretending she was fine. I stayed an extra hour and we just talked. I told her she's going to do amazing things. I think she needed to hear that. December 20th, Jane's family can't afford Christmas dinner. I used my allowance to order groceries anonymously. I didn't want them to feel like charity. I just wanted them to have a meal. Dad donates millions to causes he'll never see. I'm learning I'd rather help one person I know than 1,000 I don't. February 8th, Jane got an A on her chemistry test. She cried when she told me. An A felt impossible to her a few months ago. This is what matters, not galas, not press photos. Helping one girl believe she's capable of anything. Timothy's vision blurred. He flipped through page after page. Entries about Jane's struggles at school, her talent for science, her dreams of becoming an engineer, Emily's fierce determination to protect her, to lift her, to give her a bridge to a better life. He set the notebook down and opened the folder. Inside were receipts, grocery deliveries paid for anonymously, utility bills settled through untraceable accounts, bus passes purchased in bulk. Every expense traced back to Jane's family. Timothy calculated quickly. Thousands of dollars. Emily had been quietly supporting Jane's household with money she'd scraped together from her own allowance, birthday gifts, small inheritances from grandparents, money he'd given her freely, never asking how she spent it. While he'd written six-figure checks to distant causes and posed for photos at charity galas, Emily had been funding a life he'd never bothered to see. The final pages of the notebook were dated just weeks before Emily's death. March 15th, Jane turns 18 in 2 years. I've been researching college scholarships, financial aid, housing options. I want to help her apply to every program she's qualified for, which is all of them. Maybe I can even convince Dad to let her intern at the company. If I can just get him to see her, really see her, he'll understand why this matters so much. March 22nd. I love Dad, I do, but he lives behind walls. Walls of money and power and distance. He helps the world from boardrooms, but he doesn't know people, not really. I want him to meet Jane. I want him to see what I see. That helping one person, truly helping them, is worth more than 100 press releases. March 28th. If something ever happens to me, I hope Jane remembers she's brilliant. I hope Dad learns to see people the way I wish he'd seen me. Timothy's hands shook so violently the notebook fell from his grip. He covered his face, unable to contain the pain that tore from his chest. The image of Jane at the grave, kneeling, weeping, laying wildflowers, fused with Emily's words on the page. I hope Dad learns to see people the way I wish he'd seen me. He'd been blind, willfully, catastrophically blind. He'd built Emily into a symbol, a perfect daughter for press releases and shareholder meetings, while missing the real girl who had given her heart to a struggling teenager in a forgotten neighborhood. Timothy sat in Emily's room for hours, reading and rereading her diary until the sun set and darkness filled the space. When he finally stood, his legs unsteady, his face wet with tears, he knew what he had to do. He needed to find Jane again, not to accuse, not to question, but to know what really happened the day Emily died, and to finally, truly see the girl his daughter had loved. Jane's hands trembled when she read Timothy Lee's text. I need to speak with you. Please come to my home. I'll send a car. The message terrified her. Rich men didn't invite girls like her to their mansions for friendly conversations. They called lawyers. They threatened restraining orders. They made problems disappear. But something in Jane, some stubborn thread of loyalty to Emily, told her she owed him the truth. She texted back a single word, okay. The black town car picked her up 2 blocks from her apartment because Jane didn't want her grandmother asking questions she couldn't answer. The driver said nothing as they left her neighborhood, cramped buildings, corner stores, chain-link fences, and headed toward the part of the city where trees lined streets and gates protected privacy. When they pulled through iron gates and up a curved driveway, Jane's breath caught. The mansion rose before her like something from a movie, towering white columns, expansive windows gleaming in the afternoon light, perfectly manicured lawns stretching in every direction. Timothy waited at the front door, looking smaller somehow, less intimidating than at the cemetery. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. Jane followed him inside, her worn sneakers squeaking against polished marble floors. The foyer alone was bigger than her entire apartment. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, original artwork lined the walls. Spotless rooms branched off in every direction. Everything screamed wealth, permanence, a life so far removed from hers it felt like a different planet. She felt small, out of place, like an intruder. Timothy led her to a sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a garden. He gestured to a velvet sofa. Jane perched on the edge, backpack clutched in her lap like a shield. "I found Emily's diary," Timothy said, his voice rough. He pulled out a worn notebook and opened it to pages marked with sticky notes. "She wrote about you, a lot." Jane's eyes widened as she recognized Emily's handwriting, those familiar loops and curves that had filled tutoring notes and birthday cards. Timothy read aloud, "Janina's brilliant. She just needs someone to believe in her." He looked up. "I believe you now. I believe your bond was real." Jane's throat tightened. "Thank you. I need to know what happened the day she died." Timothy's hands shook as he set the diary down. "Please, I need the whole truth." Jane closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years crash down on her chest. She'd carried this truth alone for so long, replaying it in nightmares, drowning in guilt that never released its grip. "It was a Saturday," Jane began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother's insulin ran out. We didn't have money for groceries. The school was threatening to hold my report card because I owed lunch fees. Everything was falling apart at once. I called Emily, I shouldn't have. But I didn't know who else." Jane's voice cracked. "She said she'd bring groceries and money for the fees. She told me to wait on the corner of 5th and Maple at noon." Timothy leaned forward, hands clasped tightly. "I waited exactly where she told me. It was raining a little. I saw her car coming down 5th, and then—" Jane's breath hitched. A truck ran the red light. I heard the screech of tires, the sound of metal crushing metal. It was so loud. Tears streamed down Jane's face. I ran to her. The airbag had deployed, but she was bleeding from her head. I pulled the door open and grabbed her hand. I called 911. I stayed with her until the ambulance came. Timothy's face had gone pale, his eyes wet. "In the ambulance, she squeezed my hand," Jane sobbed. "She looked at me and she said—" Jane had to force the words out through tears. She said, "Tell my dad to see people, really see them, and tell him I love him." The room fell silent except for Jane's broken sobs and the sound of Timothy's sharp, ragged breathing. "Those were her last words," Jane whispered, "and I've been carrying them for 3 years because I didn't know how to find you. I didn't know if you'd even believe me." Timothy stood abruptly and turned away, his shoulders shaking. When he spoke, his voice was raw, shattered. "She died bringing you help. She died doing exactly what I should have been doing all along." Jane couldn't stop crying. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. If I hadn't called her—" "No." Timothy turned back, tears streaming down his face. "Don't you dare blame yourself. Emily chose love. She chose to see you. That's who she was." His voice broke, and I was too blind to see her. They stood in that opulent room, billionaire and teenager, father and stranger, both shattered by the same truth they'd buried for too long. Emily's last words hung between them, finally spoken, finally heard. After Jane finished speaking, after her tears had slowed and the silence between them had grown heavy with shared grief, Timothy looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face: humility. Will you take me to your home, Mum? He asked quietly. I need to understand the world Emily chose to be part of. Jane blinked, startled. My home? Please, I need to see it. They walked through Jane's neighborhood instead of taking Timothy's town car. He'd insisted. Jane led him through streets she knew by heart, but Timothy had only ever seen as statistics in quarterly reports. Run-down buildings with peeling paint, corner stores with barred windows, kids hanging around after school because there was nowhere else to go. Timothy said nothing, but Jane watched his face carefully. He noticed the boarded-up community center, the vacant lot filled with trash, the flyers for free meals taped to telephone poles. This was the place his board members discussed in PowerPoint presentations about urban poverty rates and economic revitalization zones. Numbers and trends, not stories, not people, not real. At Jane's apartment building, the front door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. The hallway smelled of old cooking grease and mildew. Jane climbed the stairs to the third floor, Timothy following silently behind her, his polished shoes echoing on concrete steps worn smooth by decades of use. Nana, Jane called as she opened the door. I brought someone. Her grandmother emerged from the kitchen, a small woman in her 70s wearing a faded house dress and slippers held together with tape. She froze when she saw Timothy, his expensive suit, his carefully groomed appearance, everything about him screaming wealth and power. Mrs. Bridge, Timothy said gently, extending his hand. I'm Timothy Lee, Emily's father. Jane watched her grandmother's face shift from confusion to recognition to something like fear. Mr. Lee, she said, voice trembling slightly. I'm sorry for your loss. She was an angel to us. Timothy nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Jane showed him the cramped apartment. 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen barely big enough for one person, a living room with furniture held together by determination and duct tape. Bills sat stacked on the counter, overdue notices in red, payment plans negotiated and renegotiated. But everything was clean as Jane and her grandmother could keep it with quiet pride and relentless effort. This was where Emily had come every Saturday. This was the world she'd chosen to step into, while Timothy stayed insulated behind security gates and boardrooms. Thank you for letting me see this, Timothy said to Jane's grandmother before they left. His voice was thick with emotion. Emily loved your granddaughter very much. Jane's grandmother nodded, tears in her eyes, and Jane loved her. That night, Timothy sat alone in his office overlooking the city. The lights of downtown stretched before him, towers of glass and steel, monuments to commerce and achievement. The empire he'd built with ruthless precision over 3 decades. He'd spent his entire life seeing numbers, market trends, quarterly projections, stock valuations, revenue growth, shareholder returns, but he'd never truly seen people. Emily's last words echoed in his mind. Tell my dad to see people, really see them. He'd visited Jane's neighborhood today, walked streets where 16.7% of residents live below the poverty line, where kids like Jane fought daily battles he'd never had to consider, where Emily had quietly shown up every Saturday to be present, to help, to see. While he wrote checks from air-conditioned boardrooms, Emily had knelt on worn apartment floors and helped with homework. While he posed for photos at charity galas, Emily had delivered groceries in the rain. While he crafted press releases about philanthropy, Emily had held a dying girl's hand and promised to help her cross bridges he'd never bothered to build. Timothy pulled out a legal pad and began to write, his hand shaking slightly. The Emily Bridge Initiative, he wrote at the top. Not a tax deduction, not a publicity campaign, not another line item in a corporate giving budget. A real program. For kids like Jane who didn't need handouts, they needed someone who wouldn't look away. Tutoring, mentorship, college prep, job training, housing assistance. Someone present, invested, seeing them as Emily had. He sketched ideas late into the night. Partnerships with schools, scholarship funds, internship programs at his company. Not distant charity, but sustained presence. Not statistics, but stories. Not numbers, but names. Emily had shown him the way. Now it was his turn to finally see. Timothy stood at the head of the mahogany conference table, facing 12 board members whose combined net worth exceeded most nations' GDP. They stared at him with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright concern. The Emily Bridge Initiative, Timothy began, pulling up the presentation he'd worked on for 2 weeks. A comprehensive mentorship and scholarship pipeline centered in underserved neighborhoods. Tutoring, college prep, career pathways, long-term investment in individual students. Richard Chen, the CFO, spoke first. Timothy, we appreciate the sentiment, but the projected cost over 5 years is substantial. What's the ROI? The return, Timothy said quietly, is that we'll change lives, real lives, not statistics. That's not a business metric, someone muttered. Sarah Martinez, head of marketing, leaned forward. The optics concern me. If we center this in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods, we risk accusations of performative activism. The press could tear us apart. Timothy felt his jaw tighten. A month ago, he would have agreed. A month ago, he would have chosen the safe, sanitized version. Scholarships awarded at a distance, press releases with carefully chosen faces, impact measured in tax deductions. Not anymore. I'm committing $10 million of personal funds to seed the program, Timothy said, and I'm asking the company to match it. This isn't a PR campaign. It's a commitment to presence. The room fell silent. Jane sat in the Riverside Community Center with Mrs. Lopez and Timothy, sketching ideas on a whiteboard covered with sticky notes and scribbled concepts. The kids need more than homework help, Jane said, marker in hand. They need someone who shows up, consistently. Emily didn't just tutor me. She remembered my birthday, asked about my grandmother, helped me believe I was smart when everyone else made me feel stupid. Timothy scribbled notes furiously. What else? College application support, real support. Not just here's a scholarship link. Someone to help with essays, financial aid forms, campus visits, and career exposure, internships, job shadowing, networking. Mrs. Lopez nodded. In counseling, these kids carry trauma. Poverty isn't just about money. It's stress, instability, feeling invisible. They need mental health support. Jane added another note to the board. Make it personal, not transactional. Timothy looked at what they'd built together. A program shaped not by boardrooms, but by the people who understood what kids like Jane actually needed. Emily would have loved this, he said softly. Jane felt tears prick her eyes. Yeah, she would have. 2 weeks later, Timothy returned to the boardroom with Jane at his side. She wore a borrowed blazer that didn't quite fit, but she held her head high. This is Jane Bridge, Timothy said. She's going to tell you why this program matters. Jane spoke for 10 minutes. No slides, no jargon, just her story. Emily's tutoring, the groceries, the promise, the accident, the 3 years of grief and guilt. When she finished, several board members wiped their eyes. I'm moving forward with the Emily Bridge Initiative, Timothy announced, with or without corporate support. But I'm hoping you'll choose people over shareholders. Just this once. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it passed. As plans took shape, Jane found herself battling a familiar guilt. She sat with Timothy in his office one evening, staring at photos of Emily they'd chosen for the center's memorial wall. I feel like I'm stealing her place, Jane whispered. Like I'm taking credit for something she started. Timothy looked at her with a gentleness that reminded her of Emily. You're not replacing her, Jane. You're continuing what she started. Emily built a bridge to you. Now you're helping me extend it to others. Jane nodded, tears streaming down her face. She'd really want this? She'd be so proud of you. 3 months later, they stood together at Riverside Community Center for the program's launch. 50 students, their families, volunteers and staff filled the small space. A photo of Emily, not the polished gala version, but a candid shot from a tutoring session, her nose scrunched in concentration, hung on the wall. Timothy stepped to the microphone, his hands shaking. He'd given hundreds of speeches as a CEO, confident, controlled, commanding. This was different. This wasn't about markets or mergers. This was about his daughter and the girl she loved. My daughter Emily taught me something I should have learned long ago, Timothy began, his voice cracking. She taught me to see people, really see them, not as statistics or beneficiaries, or tax deductions, but as human beings worthy of presence, investment, and love. He looked at Jane, standing in the front row. She smiled through tears. The Emily Bridge Initiative exists because my daughter believed one person, truly seen and supported, can change the world. And because Jane Bridge showed me she was right. The room erupted in applause. Timothy stepped away from the microphone and Jane met him halfway. They'd built something real. Together. The morning was still gray when Timothy returned to the cemetery, but the grayness felt softer now, less like grief, more like reverence. He walked the familiar stone path carrying two bouquets, sunflowers for Emily, her favorite, symbols of loyalty and devotion, and wildflowers for Jane to place, humble and honest like the girl who'd first brought them. Jane was already there. She sat on the weathered bench near Emily's grave, a worn notebook open in her lap, Emily's old tutoring notes that Timothy had given her weeks ago. When she saw Timothy approaching, she stood, and for the first time, her smile wasn't weighed down by guilt. "Good morning," Timothy said quietly. "Good morning," Jane replied. They walked together to Emily's headstone and knelt side by side, the sunflowers and wildflowers cradled between them. The morning dew had settled on the engraved letters of Emily's name, making them shimmer like they were alive. Timothy reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I want you to have something." Jane opened it carefully. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a small charm in the shape of a bridge. Engraved on the back were the words, "Keep crossing, Emily." Jane's breath caught. This was hers? She wore it every day, Timothy said, his voice thick. "I found it in her diary box. I think she'd want you to have it, to remind you that you're continuing what she started." Jane slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you." Timothy took a deep breath and turned to Emily's grave. "Emily," he began, his voice trembling, "I'm sorry I didn't see you fully in life. I'm sorry I built walls between us, made of work and distance and pride. You were trying to show me how to really see people, and I was too blind to notice." Jane placed her hand on the gravestone, her fingers tracing Emily's name. "Emily," she whispered, "thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for building a bridge I didn't know I needed." Together, they laid the flowers, sunflowers and wildflowers, loyalty and honesty, side by side. Timothy looked at Jane, this girl his daughter had loved so fiercely. "I didn't know her on bar," he said softly. "Not the way you did. But I want to keep learning from you, from her memory." Jane met his eyes, her voice steady despite her tears. "We'll do it together." 6 weeks later, the Riverside Community Center bustled with life. Kids filled the tables, some hunched over math problems, others laughing over books, a few practicing for college interviews with volunteers who'd committed to showing up week after week. Outside, a small garden had been planted in Emily's honor. Sunflowers grew tall along the fence, their bright faces turned toward the light. A hand-painted mural covered the center's exterior wall. Emily's face surrounded by bridges of every color, each bridge holding names of students the program had helped. Inside, Jane sat at a scratch table with a 13-year-old girl named Maria, Emily's old tutoring notes spread between them. Jane explained a geometry problem the way Emily had once explained it to her, patiently, without judgment, making Maria feel seen and smart. "You got this," Jane said, her voice echoing Emily's. "You just needed someone to show you the bridge." Maria smiled, confidence blooming on her face. "Can you come back next week?" "Every week," Jane promised. Timothy stood in the doorway watching, not from the distance of a boardroom or behind the lens of a publicity campaign, but right there, present, invested, seeing. He watched Jane lean over Maria's notebook, her silver bracelet catching the light. He saw Mrs. Lopez coordinating volunteers with fierce pride. He heard laughter and encouragement filling spaces that had once held only struggle. Emily's love hadn't ended the day she died. It had simply changed hands. From Emily to Jane, from Jane to Maria, from one person to another, building bridges that would outlast them all. Timothy finally understood what Emily had tried to teach him. Real change wasn't written in quarterly reports or measured in tax deductions. It lived in moments like this, a girl helping another girl believe she was capable of anything, continuing a legacy of compassion that refused to die. He pulled out his phone and took a photo, not for press releases or shareholders, but for himself, to remember the day he finally learned to see. On the wall behind Jane, Emily's mural smiled down at them all, her nose scrunched in that familiar way, surrounded by bridges she'd built and bridges still being built in her name. Timothy whispered to the air, to Emily, to the love that had brought them all together. Thank you for teaching me what really matters. And in the laughter of kids who finally felt seen, in Jane's patient voice guiding Maria through problems that once felt impossible, in the sunflowers growing tall and strong toward the light, Emily answered, if this story moved you, share the moment. Don't let it fade. Follow Motherland Stories and tap that like button to keep these voices alive. Every day we uncover strong stories, raw truths, and quiet acts of courage that shape our world. Join a circle of listeners, dreamers, and changemakers, because every story deserves to be heard. This wasn't just an episode, it was a call to remember. Silence hides injustice. Courage exposes it. At Motherland Stories, we don't turn away. We bear witness. Subscribe and stand with stories that challenge power and celebrate truth.